of the questions that we get asked very often is, where did all those things come from that we're displaying in the Red Barn, or at Oshkosh when we have 28,000 square feet of display for memorabilia from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and particularly youth ministries and Pathfinders. And I'm delighted to say, from good people. Since we've been here this week, we have received patches from Union Youth Director, from individuals that are historians in their conferences, from an individual that's a historian for the Inter-American Division. We share materials back and forth. And I wanted to share with you one of the things that we received that really got me excited. Of course, the whole box got me excited. The youth instructor, youths, you got to put an S on that, instructor, November 20, 1923. And in spite of what you might think, that was before I was born. I went to the junior section. You know, we didn't have junior guide yet, and we didn't have Accent or any of the other papers that came later. This was the forerunner. And I went to the junior section, and it had the Pathfinder Law, and I'm sure a lot of you know that Pathfinder Law. I'd always read that it was written originally by Arthur W. Spalding in 1919 for a group of boys that he started a club for. They had wanted to join Boy Scouts, and that just wouldn't work with our Adventist lifestyle and our eating habits. And so he started, because his boys pressured him, a little club for his boys and their friends. And he wrote this law. See if you can catch what's different. Keep the morning watch. Hold up my end. Care for my body. Keep a level eye. Be courteous and obedient. Walk softly in the sanctuary. Keep a song in my heart and go on God's errands. Did you catch what was different? Hold up my end. What do we say? Do my honest part. Terminologies were a little bit different back in 1919, obviously. Our terminology for that, do my honest part. Hold up my end. I had to look and see what it said about that. It said thrift, trustworthiness, and courage. Courtesy, being involved. And we're hoping that if you're here and you're available, that you'll come tomorrow sometime between 2 and 5:30 and see some of the displays in the Red Barn. And it's a bit chilly in there. It is a barn, so you'll want to wear your warm jackets. But come and see how God has led youth and youth ministry through the years. And we really appreciate all the people that are involved in this ministry. Thank you.
At this time, it's a pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker this evening. I was informed that he began his illustrious career in washing dishes in the cafeteria at Pacific Union College. But I noticed from the resume that's given in this little booklet that you all have, or some of you should have anyway, that is probably his most important part of his career, of his life, is the fact that he and his wife Sarah have 3 adult children and 3 grandchildren. I can kind of relate to that a little bit. So that definitely has to be the most important part of his life. He is currently the director of the Center for Adventist Research and the White Estate branch office at Andrews University. And I asked him if I should be introduced, he should be introduced as Elder Merlin Burt or Dr. Merlin Burt, and he said, Merlin. So, Merlin, welcome.
It's a beautiful Sabbath day, isn't it? It's nice to see some old friends that I haven't seen for a long time, some on the platform and some in the audience, and the Lord is good. We have a youth heritage celebration weekend with the theme, Lest We Forget Our Youth Today. As I thought about what I would share this evening, what rose high in my heart was a realization of how God has led in the past in our movement through young people. Too often we talk about young people in an emerging sense, as if they are not yet fully engaged. And if there's one thing that our history teaches us, it's that God engaged young people in full leadership when they were young. And that engagement when they were young led many times to a growing influence and leadership that then became a lifelong service for Jesus that made an ever-growing impact upon people, upon the church, and upon the world. When we think of the Bible, how much of the Bible is history? Almost all of it, isn't that right? It starts with creation, the 7 days of creation. You march through the Bible and you have history, 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 history. And God retells this history with clarity and honesty in a way that causes people to see the failings and the weaknesses, but also how His Spirit worked and what He did to create something beautiful, something powerful through the working of His Spirit. So a sacred view of history involves understanding how God has worked in history, even with sinful, broken people. The text I want to make our touchstone this evening, as I'm going to be telling you 9 brief stories. It sounds like a lot, but don't worry, I won't keep you here too long. 9 brief stories of early Adventist people but the text I want us to start with is Hebrews 11. The title of my presentation is Listening to the Witnesses for God's Dear Cause. Hebrews 11 contains the stories, or at least the reference to many different people who were people of faith, people who didn't see always what God was doing, but they followed Him. Now, we could talk about the different ones, but as I reflected on the names, many of the people in Hebrews 11 began as young people in their service for God. Think of a few of the names that are mentioned in Hebrews 11. We have Moses, isn't that right? Now, he had a very long training experience, didn't he? But nevertheless, it begins and engages for him when he was young. And then we come down to Isaac, who, of course, his engagement begins as he is even to be a sacrifice to represent Jesus and his experiences. And Jacob and the story of his fleeing young people again. Of course, Samuel, as a young person, as a child, is called by God to be a prophet, perhaps the youngest prophet in the Bible. I don't know of any others maybe that were called younger than him, called as a child to be a prophet, and then has a lifelong experience. And of course, the story of David. So many of the people in Hebrews 11, the people of faith, are young people whose story is remembered from when they were young, and God engages them, and they begin to engage in the work of God, even though they are still relatively young as people. Let's walk through some brief stories of some early Adventist pioneers. I want to first begin with these 2 people. This is the earliest picture we have of James and Ellen White. The 3 principal founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church were James and Ellen White and Joseph Bates. Of course, Joseph Bates was an older man in middle age. We say older, middle ages. He wasn't so old, it seems, as you get older. He seems younger the longer I live. But nevertheless, the other 2, James and Ellen White, were both very young and before they were married. James White's experience was very rapid, beginning in his teen years. He had a vision problem that corrected itself in his mid-teens. and he was able to go to school. And he very rapidly completed his education, and within just a few years, he had gained enough education and training to become a teacher himself. But he felt a call to preach as well. And so he tells his story a little bit. I won't take time to tell it to you. During his teen years, and just as he's in his early 20s, the first part of his 20s, as he's becoming a Christian Connection minister, a young person yet who is passionate. His mother helps convert him to the Millerite movement. She gets him finally to go to some Millerite camp meetings, and he engages with energy. And he doesn't have any resources. You know, God takes particularly young people. You know, we get a little bit older, we feel like we have to have all the resources lined up to work for God. Isn't that right? Sometimes we do as we get older. But he didn't have any resources. His father loans him a horse. A minister friend gives him a saddle that's missing parts that he has to nail on and connect. He has a pair of reins that are broken in several places. The leather is rotted and pulled apart, and so he nails it back together. And he says, I'm going to preach. And he starts out not in the spring, but in the fall. As the weather's getting cold, he begins to work his way down the state of Maine. And I can't tell you the story. We spend the whole evening talking about James White. But through that winter of 1842 into 1843, when he is just 21 years old, going towards 22 years of age, James White is preaching. Gerald Wheeler, who wrote the biography of James White, a more recent biography, as he looked at the sources, concluded and felt that during that winter and that time in the Millerite movement, James White probably gained about 1,000 converts to the soon coming of Jesus. Just think about that. The lack of resources, but yet the fervor, the dedication, the determination, and this is before he even becomes a Sabbatarian and becomes a part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. A young person who felt passion for Jesus and his soon coming, used powerfully by God. The other person here, Ellen White, we know about her, of course. Ellen White's conversion and her first testimonies occur in her very early teens, mid-teens actually. Probably 15, 16, she's sharing her testimony publicly. Very hard for her because she was introverted. And then God gives her, just as she's barely 17, a vision. And she begins a prophetic ministry that will go for a lifetime, a little more than 70 years. But she begins at the age of 17. She faced tremendous conflicts and difficulties, trying to navigate, or God in using her to keep together a little group after that disappointment so that Sabbatarian Adventism could emerge on the other side. I'm still amazed when I think about how God kept her and helped her through those early years. There was fanaticism that was raging there, terrible problems. And there was an older man, a leading minister in the church named Joseph Turner, or in the Millerite movement, who attacked her and tried to control her. And yet God, step by step, preserved her. She went down into Massachusetts to share for the first time, and Turner follows her. And so we have this older man, or actually two men, Turner and another man, who are opposing her, a teenager still. And yet God carries her through this. And while most people have forgotten the name of Joseph Turner and John Howell, very few today have forgotten the name Ellen White. Isn't that right? Ellen Harmon. God used her in a powerful and incredible way. Again, when she was young, beginning when she was young during her formative years. The next person is a little more obscure. Now, I know of two people, at least in this room, who know who this is. I'm sure it's up on this. Well, I guess the name is up there, but you may still not know who he is. William H. Hyde was a young man who was actually almost Ellen White's age. He was about 3 months younger than her, so he also is 17 in the spring of 1845. And he gets involved with some of these fanatics James White and Ellen Harmon get him to come away when he's very ill. They pray for him. He's sick. He has what they call bloody dysentery, and he is restored, healed directly as they gather around him to pray. These are young people, many of them, gathering around a young person to pray. And he gets out of the bed, eats a farmer's meal. He's a young person anyway. His appetite is returned, even though he's been so ill. And this is a miracle of God. Just a few months later, or weeks, we don't know the exact date, Ellen Harmon, who was Ellen White later, had her third major vision, which we refer to today, or she refers to, as her New Earth vision. How many of you have heard of Ellen White's New Earth vision? I'm just curious. Okay? Yeah, many of you have. She was taken to the New Earth at the end of the millennium, where she walked, not literally, but she was shown it. God can do that, isn't that right? In vision. She walked with Jesus in the New Earth. And she sees the living green grass. She sees the beautiful forests that are not dark, but light and glorious. She meets martyrs who even have a red hem around their robes. And she meets two people, Charles Fitch and Levi Stockman, who had already passed away before she had her vision. And they try to talk to her and ask her what had happened. And she's there in this glorious place. She says, I can't think of anything. Heaven is cheap enough. Hallelujah. We can't talk about those other things. It's not even worth remembering. And she's with Jesus. She comes to the table to sit down and eat. And Jesus stops her and he says, no, you have to go back. You have to tell people what you have seen. And she comes out of that vision, and her first words are, oh, it's dark. It's so dark. Oh, that I had wings like a dove, that I could fly away and be at rest. I've seen, she said, a better land. Amen? We want to be in that land, don't we? Now, in that setting, as she had this vision, was this man, William Hyde. Now, this is not him too young. Many of these pictures I'm showing you, I got the earliest picture almost I could find, okay, in age. But only a few of them are at the correct age. But this man, William Hyde, who had been healed, was present when she had this vision, and it so deeply moved him that he wrote a poem. He titled it The Better Land, or We Have Heard, and it became a song. In fact, this song is the earliest song that I'm aware of that's directly connected to our movement, the Sabbatarian Adventist and Seventh-day Adventist movement. Now, there are many Millerite songs, there are many good songs, but this one has direct genesis in the movement. It first appeared, actually, in the Advent Harp, which was a first-day Adventist publication. And you can see it up on the screen here, We Have Heard. And the words are put to music. Not long after this, very close to this time, James White published his first songbook, Hymns for God's Peculiar People Who Keep the Commandments of God and Have the Faith of Jesus. Nice long title, right? Shortened to Hymns. But this little hymnal included this song as well, and it has been in each of our hymnals down through this to the present time. And I don't know if you want to take a moment, open your hymnal in front of you and look at page 453. I think as we've talked about it and we've sung about it in recent years, more people are becoming a little bit aware of it, but it still is woefully neglected and not even in people's consciousness. We won't try to sing it here, but I want you to see it on page 453. And I want to read briefly this poem by William Hyde, this young man who was 17 himself when he wrote the poem, and it was based upon a vision that another 17-year-old had that God gave her of the new earth. Teenagers. He wrote, "We have heard from the bright, the Holy Land. We have heard and our hearts are glad, for we were a lonely pilgrim band and weary and worn and sad. They tell us the saints have a dwelling there, no longer are homeless ones, and we know that the goodly land is fair where life's pure river runs. They say green fields are waving there that never a blight shall know, and the deserts wild are blooming fair, and the roses of Sharon grow. There are lovely birds in the bowers green. Their songs are blithe and sweet, and their warblings gushing ever new, the angels' harpings greet. We have heard of the palms, the robes, the crowns, and the silvery band in white, of the city fair with pearly gates, all radiant with light. We have heard of the angels there and saints, with the harps of gold, how they sing. Of the mount with the fruitful tree of life, of the leaves that healing bring. Oh, and then it has to come to Jesus. It has to end with the King. Isn't that right? Because it was Jesus who was leading Ellen White in that vision. The King of that country, he is fair. He's the joy and light of the place. In his beauty we shall behold him there and bask in his smiling face. We'll be there in a little while. We'll join the pure, the blessed. We'll have the palm, the robe, the crown, and forever be what? At rest. Written by a 17-year-old in response to a vision that God gave. I think another interesting story that comes from 1845 is the story of how the Sabbath came to Paris Hill, Maine. Now, maybe you have heard of the names of Marion and Louis Stoll. I don't know if you've heard that name. I don't have a picture of Marion here, but I do have a picture of Louis Stoll. These, again, were young people living still with their parents. She was 15 in 1845. Her brother was 16. So these are younger than the story we just talked about. Marion's father, Louis, received a tract that had just been published by T.M. Preble on the Sabbath in March of 1845. And it interested the young girl. She read it, she studied it, and her parents had not yet, no one else had. She decided to keep the Sabbath based upon her Bible study and reading this tract. After that first Sabbath, she talked to her brother, Louis, this man, a little later in life picture, but this man nonetheless, and he decided to keep the Sabbath. They then passed the tract over to a neighbor friend of theirs named J.N. Andrews. And this, we have a fairly young picture of him. I want you to look at this picture with me for a moment. J.N. Andrews is the one sitting, holding the book there, or the Bible. Notice his hand, his right hand. What's he doing with his hand? It's clenched, right? This is a man with determination, with passion, with energy. And even his facial expressions show the intensity of his experience. He reads the tract. He also decides to accept the Sabbath and shares it with his parents. And his parents say, well, where'd you get this? He says, well, it was with the Stolls. Oh, okay, we know the Stolls. And they read it, and pretty soon J.N. Andrews' parents have accepted the Sabbath, and then the Stoll parents accept the Sabbath, and then there's a little group of Sabbath keepers there in 1845 in Paris and Paris Hill, Maine, led by God's working in the hearts and the lives of teenagers, 15, 16 years of age. J.N. Andrews, by the way, is 15 years of age at this time. So 15 and 16 years old. And so the Sabbath comes to this region right here. I think some of you have seen this picture before. This is believed to be a self-portrait of Annie Smith, at least by the family, the ones that I've talked to, some who have passed away now, and others have believed this as well. Uriah and Annie Smith were incredibly talented young people. Annie Smith was converted to the Advent message in 1851. Very quickly, James White engaged her in the church, or in the work of the church. She was 23 years old. This is a little bit older, but nevertheless, she's still a young person. At this time, younger also a little bit than Ellen White. She wrote a poem in the Review and Herald, her first poem, in September 16, 1851, titled "Fear Not, Little Flock." And then she joined the publishing office when it moved to Rochester, New York, the next year. And when James White would travel, often Annie was responsible for keeping the Review and Herald going, the publication of the paper. This young person, so very talented. She arranged and had some influence, I think, in having her brother, Uriah Smith, also join the office. But during her short 3 years working there in the Advent office, she wrote 45 poems in the Youth Instructor and Review and Herald, and a number of our songs in this hymnal still come from Annie Smith and poems that she had written. Tragically, she contracted tuberculosis and died on July 26, 1855. Uriah Smith, her younger brother, joined the Review and Herald office at the time that he was still only 20 years old. I don't have a picture of him at the age of 20, but this is a little bit younger of a picture of Uriah Smith. He would go on to become the editor at the age of 23, 3 years later. Now, I don't know how it is in many of our conferences, but usually you don't go from being employed to editor when you're that young in 3 years. Nevertheless, for Uriah Smith, it happened. And he continued through most of the rest of his life as editor of the Review and Herald, a period of nearly 50 years with some breaks. I want to take you a little bit further forward in time and mention a revival that happened in 1867, Christmas of 1867, in the Washington, New Hampshire church. This is a picture of Eugene Farnsworth, again, not as a young man, but as an adult. Eugene was one of the 22 children of William Farnsworth, and he describes his experience and traces his own conversion to this revival in Christmas 1867, over the Christmas time of 1867. Things had gotten very low spiritually in the Washington, New Hampshire church, and James and Ellen White and Jane Andrews came to try to bring life back to that church. And as a part of that weekend, or the number of days that they were there, God did something very special through Ellen White. He gave her vision with direct counsel to individuals in that congregation and those related to that congregation. And in the meeting, she was speaking to them, some in encouragement, some in warning, some in rebuke, but all in love, because God was trying to redeem them and draw him back to himself. And in the midst of this testimony time, as Ellen White is speaking and people are responding, some of them with tears, many of them with tears, some of them, the tears would come a little bit later. Eugene Farnsworth, young Eugene, who was 19 years old at the time, thought to himself, and this is from his own recollections, he said in his recollection, I thought, I wish he would tackle the case of my father. Because you see, William Farnsworth had begun to chew tobacco, or had continued to chew tobacco, and he had said that he had given it up. And Eugene knew he hadn't. And Ellen White turned to him and wrote and said, I saw that this brother, speaking of William Farnsworth, the father of this man, Eugene, I saw that this brother is a slave to tobacco, but worst of the matter is that he's acting the part of a hypocrite, trying to deceive his brethren into thinking he has discarded it. Now, William Farnsworth stood up and repented, but the impact that we probably need to remember most is on young Eugene. He was deeply affected. Other young people had been at some other meetings, and Eugene remembered, Orville Farnsworth remembered his own conversion, another one of the young people there. He says, I went with some of my brother to exchange Christmas gifts with our cousins Fred and Rose Mead. Because of the meeting's previous evening, we were delayed by 1 day. Fred, this is Fred Mead, had been a rather wild boy, but he was present at the morning meeting, and he and his sister had taken their stand for Christ. Now they felt a burden for souls, and we, Orville and the one with him, were invited into Fred's room. where after an earnest appeal, think of this, young Fred, who was the wild boy, has just had her conversion experience. He appeals in his bedroom to Orville and to the others, and Orville says that he gave his heart to Jesus there by that bed himself. The result of this revival, while it impacted the adults, it resulted in a great reviving of the church. It led to the conversion of 18 young people. Half of them, 9, would become church workers in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, many of them leading workers. One of them is this man, Eugene. If I had time, I could talk about each one of them. It's a very interesting story. The impact, the ripple effect of what God did in and through the lives of young people in this revival is a profound memory that we need to keep in our minds as we think of listening to the witnesses of God's leading in the past. I will only briefly mention this man, John Harvey Kellogg, but to mention to him that he was made by James White the medical superintendent, in other words, the head of the Health Reform Institute when he was 24 years of age. He went on very quickly to establish a new building, a new operation, Battle Creek Sanitarium, and of course, we're in Battle Creek. Many of you are aware of some of the story, or a lot of the story, of John Harvey Kellogg and what God did in his life and through him and for him, and some of his struggles, I'm sure, as well. But God led James White and Ellen White to consistently put people into leadership who were in their early 20s, important places of leadership in the early movement, just like they themselves had been in important places of leadership in their younger years. We can't end this without mentioning another couple of people. This is a picture of the J. and Andrews family. It has a picture of J. and Andrews, his wife, their son Charles, and daughter Mary. Tragically, Angelin passed away in 1872 of a stroke. But J. and Andrews, as he struggled with his grief, determined he was still going to go if God called him as a missionary. And 2 years later, in 1874, Jan Andrews and his two children. Here's a picture of young Mary, an early tintype of her. And then there's also, this is a little bit earlier, but I don't have, this is the picture I have right now of Charles and Mary as young people. At least we do have of them as young people. The three of them went to Europe. And they were not just the kids along with their missionary dad. They were a trio of missionaries with the father as the leader. I have been deeply moved by a couple of things. One of them, doesn't deeply move me as much, but I find it interesting. You've maybe heard this, and I'm seeing my friend Jim Nix here, and he's shared this. I've probably heard him share it 50 times over the years. But we have the original at the Center for Adventist Research, and this is a picture of this original covenant that they signed in 1876. Now, this is an interesting thing to think about. This is 2 years after they arrived. It's a covenant to only speak the French language or German. So even after 2 years, what's happening? They're still struggling to get language proficiency. But Mary is doing better than the rest. I honestly kind of think that this covenant was as much or more for the father as anyone else, even though Jan Andrews was very good with languages. But what moves me is this. I don't think I've ever made reference to these in public before. Maybe I've mentioned that there were 3 letters. But a few years ago, when a descendant of Jan Andrews died, Jeannie Andrews, a great-granddaughter, she donated a lot of materials from Jan Andrews' time, original materials, and among them are these 3 letters. They are letters written by Mary Andrews, the daughter, who went as a missionary with her father and continued for 3 years until she would die in 1878 at the age of 17. So Mary was just 13 when they went to Europe, and Charles was a month short of 16. So they were young people, both engaged in the work with their father. Charles learned the printing trade, and helped with the publication of the French Signs of the Times. After both his sister and father passed away, later Jane Andrews would also pass away in 1883, he came back to the United States and continued as a printer or working in publishing in the Review and Herald office for the rest of his life. But in Europe, he was the one who learned and helped with the printing operation. Mary, on the other hand, had to take the place of her mother, who had passed away in 1872, and do the cooking and maintain the household. One of these letters from 1876, she writes, interestingly, to her father, who's away in Switzerland, or is in Germany, and they're in Switzerland. She writes to him to please bring home a loaf of German bread. And then she continues and says, ours is awful sour. We have a loaf, and I guess it'll last us a whole week. So she's putting up with this loaf of bread, I guess sourdough bread, I'm not sure. Unfamiliar bread, and she's hoping the German bread will be better. So you can see she's engaging with the importance of taking care of the food issues for the family. So, Dad, please bring some German bread when you come home. I don't know how they liked that really hard, dark German bread. Maybe it was okay. I don't have a letter that says what they thought of that. But I presume that was the type of bread that Jane Andrews would bring back. Two of the other letters here are written during just months before Mary dies. She contracted what was called quick consumption. This is tuberculosis that advanced very rapidly. And before she died, Jane Andrews brought her to the United States to the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and she died there. But she's not buried here in Battle Creek. Her father took her to Rochester, New York, where his wife and actually two other little children are buried. And so Mary is buried there with them. But these two other letters have a very interesting story and a picture connected with them. They're both letters one is a letter to her father and one is a letter to her grandmother. And both of them show that she is closely engaged in the work. She is actively participating in what is happening while her father is gone. In one of the letters, she writes that she is arranging to do proofreading of the German publications and tracts that they're working on here in 1878. The other letter is very interesting because she describes to her grandmother, this is in June of 1878, she describes how she was sending copies of the French Signs of the Times to anyone she could find with an address that had any type of connection that she might be able to get them to be interested in reading it. And with that, she would write them a note, a card, so that they could return and reply back, and maybe they could develop some Bible study interests. And in this letter to her grandmother, she reports that one of these men that she had written to wrote back to her and wrote to her these words. You can almost see the chuckles in the line as she's writing it. She said, he addressed me as, quote, very honored sir. And so she went on to describe that this man was involved in temperance work. And she had sent an issue of the Signs of the Times that involved some temperance materials. And he wanted to know more from this very honored sir, who was a young lady of still 16, almost 17 years of age. She continued to report that there were 20 strangers who had attended a large meeting that had been held there, and she was maintaining correspondence with various ones connected with that and those working in the mission work. So Mary is not just a child of the missionary, she is engaging as a young person, also as a missionary, a young adult or a teenage missionary for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She passed away in Battle Creek Sanitarium on November 27, 1878, just a few months after these two letters that I just described to you. This is another picture of Mary, one that's maybe more familiar to many, taken probably not too long before she passed away. The last story I want to take a moment to tell you about is this woman, Anna Knight. This is a picture of her as a nurse. She was born in post-Civil War Mississippi and faced all the obstacles that a young black woman had to endure or suffer in the South during that time. After her conversion, which is a remarkable experience itself that I don't have time to tell you, she came to Battle Creek College in her early 20s and finished the nursing course at the age of 24. She went back, though, to Mississippi, and she decided she wanted to start a school for blacks so that they could learn to read, they could begin to know Jesus and know the Lord. And so she established this school. But in 1901, a few years later, she was asked to go as a missionary at the age of 27 to India to become the first female black missionary in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the first black missionary of any denomination to go to India. Now, I'm not going to tell you about her work in India, but I want to just bring us to an interesting thing. She's still following what happened in Mississippi in the school that she started down there. And she finds out that someone has come and that burned the school down. There's been opposition to this effort to bring education and faith to blacks in the South. And when she finally comes home on furlough, her first job on furlough is not to take a break, but to spend 2 years back down in Mississippi rebuilding both the schoolhouse and the educational program there. And you can read something of this in the book. Some of you maybe are familiar with the book Mississippi Girl. I'm curious if any of you have read this. A number of you have. Here we have again a woman who has many obstacles facing her life, but begins in her early 20s to be used powerfully by God, and then continues in that ministry. And of course, she had a very long life and lived clear up until she passed away finally in 1972. So, what are some lessons we can learn as we press this to conclusion? Probably many, but let me just share a few with you as we're thinking today in our Youth Heritage Celebration, lest we forget our youth today. First off, conversion and a living relationship with God combined with understanding and commitment to the Advent message is fundamental for young people in service for God. If that does not happen, young people, those of you that are here or that are listening, nothing will happen, because all these stories are connected to a living faith and a commitment and a passion for God's dear cause. Second, God uses youth and young adults in both Scripture and in Adventist history in direct and dynamic ways, beginning in their childhood and youth and continuing particularly in their early to mid-20s, if you think about early Adventist history. What happens when you're younger translates often into ministry in the early to mid-20s, at least as we look at Adventist history. Number 3, usually those who are committed and engaged when young continue to expand their ministry throughout their lives with ever-increasing influence and effectiveness. Fourth, God used boys and girls, men and women, equally effectively in wide and influential ways, whether you're a man, a young man, or a young woman, a boy or a girl. And I could not help but mention today, and I know it's not a direct application, but it's a personal testimony as well as the experience of many here. I noticed a few Pathfinder uniforms in this audience. I'm looking around and I'm not seeing them. Who's wearing a uniform here? Pathfinder uniform. Well, they were here earlier. A couple of people in uniform. Pathfinders, and particularly the TLT, Teen Leadership Training Program, which is a part of Pathfinders, I think directly continues the legacy of actual ministry and dynamic connection to the church and its ministry for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, if we as a church will connect them and empower them and make them a part of the ministry of the church. They are doing ministry in that way. This cooperates with Adventist elementary and secondary education, leading to attending, hopefully at an Adventist college, like Andrews University or other schools, and leadership during early and younger years. I can myself speak to 2 of my children who went through this progression and are engaged in ministry. One of them is nearly 30, so a little bit older, but the other one has just begun at the age of 21 still to, with her husband, in pastoral ministry together, a couple ministry in Alaska. God calls and uses young people in ministry, especially when they follow the plans and the processes that God has done. I know we're trying to build an appreciation for the history and also the current ministry of Pathfinders. And I think we can say, praise God, it stands on the legacy and God's intention in the ministry of these 9 stories that I told you this evening. As I close, I would like to take us back to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And the appeal is made based upon these young people and older people and young people who grew older, and God used them in faith. The words are written, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses," and I would like to extend that cloud to include the people we've just talked about here and those whom God is calling today. "So great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." May we follow Jesus as the great cloud of witnesses, that our lives and those of other young adults and young people who we pray will be influenced to serve God, and we can see the mighty acts of God. And may it be the soon coming of Jesus Christ.
Our Father in heaven, we thank you this evening for the challenge that we have received from looking to the youth of our past. We ask that your Spirit continue to work with and through the young people of this church, and that we may all soon together be in your kingdom. In Christ's name, amen.